This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders. Today I'm honored to have John Munsell on the show. He is the co-founder of Bizzuka, which is an AI consulting and training firm, and the author of a book, which we'll be talking about a little bit today as well. Anyway, with all that being said, John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, John. It's going to be easy to catch each other's names as we go, right?
Yeah, I don't have to worry about forgetting this one.
Right.
If you don't mind, just tell the audience a little bit about your background, how you got into AI, and what is it that you're doing now with Bizzuka?
Sure. So I started off in financial services, spent about 16 years in financial services. And then when the web came out, I ejected from that to start a software development company in 97 to help people build websites, essentially, because back then nothing existed. And so we had to build every website from, the first line of code. And I just knew that was where the market was headed. So we gradually became a digital marketing agency over the years. And I don't know, around COVID, I guess it was, we started to get really involved with AI. And I thought, okay, this is getting interesting. It's not really good. It kind of talks in circles, but you could tell that it was going to get much, much better. So I want to say it was about right at 3 years ago, I was having a conversation with one of the guys that used to be an employee of mine who went on to start his own company, and then he got acquired. And then we've always been friendly competitors. And then he asked me one day, over lunch, hey, what are you going to do to grow this year? And I said, well, actually, I'm thinking that I might switch gears and kind of get out of this space. And I said, what about you? And he said, I'm thinking about growing through acquisition. And I said, well, would you be interested in acquiring a portfolio? And he said, yeah. And so he was getting his money together, and he called me 6 months later. He says, okay, we're ready to start acquiring. Are you still interested in selling? And I'm like, sure. So we sold our client portfolio to them to switch gears completely to get into AI coaching and consulting, because I felt like that's where everything was going. And then, of course, when ChatGPT came out, that's when you could see the guardrails coming off and you could do a whole lot more with it. And we started to build some training around that. And we were using it ourselves just to figure out, really how to use it effectively. And we developed some frameworks, but that's kind of how I got into it in the short run.
So when it comes to AI training and consulting, is it training and consulting people on the use of AI, or using AI to actually do training and consulting?
So we don't really, that's a great question, because we're actually going to start using AI ourselves in the training process. But in order to do that, you have to actually train the AI on your processes. But that's a down the roader. I can see where it's all heading, and we're actually building some tech around that. But right now, what we've been doing for the last 2 years is teaching people how to get the most out of AI. The problem is that everybody thinks because you can ask ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or whatever, you can ask it a question and it gives you an answer in a matter of seconds, that all of a sudden, hey man, this is easy. The problem is once you start doing it at scale, you start to realize the patterns, right? You start to recognize the outputs, and you realize this isn't really going to be helpful. So I need to do a whole lot of editing, or I needed to add more information to it. And so you go back and forth and back and forth. And so what was a way to really speed up a process really doesn't speed it up as much as you think. And Gartner, I don't know if you're familiar with Gartner research.
Yeah.
Gartner essentially has this thing they call the AI hype curve. And generative AI, which is what we specialize in training on, is entering what they call the trough of disillusionment. In fact, it's already in there, which means most people have said, hey, this was going to be great, but it's not quite great. And that's what we teach people how to do, how to, what we call how to get excellence at scale out of AI. And that's what our frameworks do. They teach businesses how to drive excellence out of AI at scale. And most of the other trainings out there just teach you why AI is important or why you need to pay attention, but none of them teach you actually how to execute. And there's a difference between asking ChatGPT to give you a response and actually getting excellence out of that response the first shot. And that's essentially what the book is that I've written. It teaches people how to do it. It's literally like an instruction manual, as opposed to just a theoretical, hey, you really ought to do this or you're going to die,
So when it comes to getting excellence out of AI, how much of that comes into what you put into it, like the prompts that you give it, what kind of context that is wrapped around those prompts, and making sure that the information, when you're talking about even going further, building your own AI and training it on models, the data that goes into those models, how important is all those pieces?
All of it's critical, right? I mean, so the thing is that if you look at most of the training, most of the YouTube videos and all that stuff in there, especially these guys that are out there saying you can get 1,000 of my prompts for $99, that kind of junk. Or I think I saw one the other day for 99 cents. All you have to do is ask ChatGPT to give you 100 prompts, and it'll do it. It's just that none of them will work, right? And so what you have to do is you have to provide context. AI's got a lot of its own, but just remember that AI has been educated on the world's content. So it doesn't know what excellence looks like. It just knows what frequency looks like. And so since it's really nothing more than a predictive engine, it's trying to predict the next word in a sentence. And frequently, how I refer to it is it thinks it paints itself into a corner with what that last word's going to be. And it comes up with a sentence that makes sense. But in terms of the context of what it's been writing, it's not the best way to say it. You know what I mean? It's a lot of complex words and sentence structures that sound good, but don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
So what we try to do is teach people what that context is that it needs to know up front, so that when you get the initial write out, whatever that might be, it's 95% of what you need. And so now your human in the loop only has a 10% or 5% tweak to make, as opposed to a back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for hours to try to get it. And that's why we developed the framework that we call the AI strategy canvas. It teaches you what those pieces are, and then you can assemble them in prompts, or you can create documentation that you would use to either fine-tune the AI or to just use as a knowledge base inside of a custom GPT or a Claude project. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense. So when you're talking about, basically you create like a template for prompts, with, kind of prompting people instead of prompting the AI, you're prompting the user to think about their context. Make sure you include pieces of the context that you want these questions and how you want the output framed before implementing it. That way, maybe, because I found whenever I put something into ChatGPT, and with my uneducated prompts, I'm getting, maybe 70% of what I want back. And then I have to go back through and read it and edit it. And, but what I hear you saying is with proper prompts and proper context, you can get maybe 95% of that.
Yeah, exactly. Not only that, but if you structure your prompt right, I always kind of liken it to a spreadsheet, right? If you ever built a spreadsheet, let's just say that you got a set of columns that forecast the entire year. So you got January through December in there, and you want to look at, say, an expense item across that whole thing. And then you want to say, what does it look like if that expense grows by 3% per month? All right. Well, you're not going to take whatever that cell is and hard code that 3% in every cell all the way across. You're going to put 3% in another cell somewhere and then have all of those rows and columns refer back to that 3% so you can change it to 8% without having to go into every individual cell and change that by 8%. So if you think about that in terms of how you structure a prompt, if you have a variable or a container that holds information, maybe that information is your persona, maybe it's a description of your company, maybe it's a description of your product. That container now could be stored somewhere in a prompt database, prompt library, whatever. And so every time now you need to go and write something that's to a specific persona, you can pull that container and pop it in there. You don't have to continuously write it. On the other end, if you have a persona, like we can either do a description of a persona. We prefer to use variables inside of the persona block. And so one of the variables might be goals. One might be mistaken beliefs. One might be sources of information, but there's so many things that you want to put into a persona block. But most companies have more than one target persona, right? And so what we want to do is create different persona profiles. And depending upon what we're writing, we want to swap those in and out. But if you already have them ready at your disposal, then that's great. And then you could also take that and build a big multi-page document that describes your persona, what that person does and what that person's thinking and what that person's feeling and what that person's pains and problems and frustrations are. You take that document and you store it, and now you can literally push that into a custom GPT or Claude project as part of your knowledge base. And so you don't have to really refer to it anymore. You just are telling the project or the GPT, look, I want you to first go and look at your knowledge base before you start making stuff up. And then it'll have all that information. And we teach people how to build those kinds of documents for your company and for your persona and for your products and services, et cetera. But when you think about the interaction you were just describing for your prompting, where you're getting 65%, right? You're asking it questions and you're going back and forth and back and forth. Now, at some point, you might say to yourself, okay, I'm going to do this again, right? Whatever it was that you were trying to produce, I'm going to do this again, whether you're trying to write a blog post or you're trying to write a letter to shareholders or whether you're trying to write a legal brief, whatever it might be, there's going to be a point where you go, I'm going to have to do this again. Well, what you need to do is you need to go back up through all of your threading and figure out, okay, how did I get here? Now, how do I compile that into a prompt that I could use over and over again? But not only that, how do I compile that into a prompt where I could swap variables in and out so I could use it for a different purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Like a letter to the shareholders could be structured one way as a prompt. But if you simply swap out the persona, instead of it being shareholders, and now it's your customers, it could be your internal employees, whatever. It'll now, the request part is write a letter about topic X. Well, topic X is a variable and the persona is a variable, essentially, or a container. Well, now you just swap one of those things out and it rewrites the whole thing, right? But if you got that stored somewhere, now that's what I talk about being scalable. So those are scalable prompts because you can swap in and out the variables, but you have a database that has them all and people in your organization can use them. So somebody in PR can use the same database, see a prompt that is designed for somebody in marketing, take it, modify it for their own purposes and roll.
Yeah, it sounds like, it totally sounds like you're taking what was a linear type structure when it comes to putting in prompts into like an object-oriented prompt, to where you're doing almost like object-oriented programming inside your prompts.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah, which is, that's the only way to scale software development. So that makes sense that that's the best way to scale
Yeah, it has to. I mean, see, the thing is everybody thinks, oh, well, NLP, natural language processing, is what these GPTs are all designed to do, where you can just have a conversation back and forth and back and forth. Yeah, that's true. But at the end of the day, it's still software, right?
Right.
And so what you want to do is combine essentially good programming technique and programming hygiene, if you will, with natural language processing. And now you've got something even more compelling and more effective and far more scalable when you do it that way. And that's the principles that we teach.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And I love the fact you're talking about building a persona. It's almost like for personal use cases, not business use cases, but personal use cases, I may use ChatGPT to help me write letters or emails to kids' teachers and things like that. So I could build a persona of like me being the father and having 3 kids, and these are the ages of my kids. These are the sports my kids play. These are the things that my kids do. So when you write this, use the perspective of someone who may have these feelings and thoughts.
Yeah. You're writing it to the recipient of whoever is going to be the beneficiary of your output, right? Or of your GPT. So, for instance, we had one of our students came through, and it is pretty fascinating. He's a brilliant chemist guy, and he files for 20, 30 patents a year. All right, doing things in the oil and gas sector. So this is like way out there kind of stuff. And we, part of our training is that we teach people our processes, and it culminates in what we call a capstone project, where they have to deliver a custom GPT at the end of it so that we know they've learned the principles. They decide what that is kind of at the beginning of it. And so I don't know, it was like 2 weeks in, he decides he's going to build a patent analyzer. Okay. He's paying $15,000 a year for this software that checks for patents and all this junk. And he's like, man, if I could do this will save me some money. And so he starts building this thing that will analyze all these patents and look for conflicts in the patent that he's getting ready to file for. So he can either bypass the conflict or just know, okay, there's a patent that already does this out there. So he's building it. And then he was saying to me, well, I don't really have a persona. And I said, yes, you do. It's the guy at the patent office who's going to review your patent. He's like, oh, I never thought about it that way. So then all of a sudden he builds it that way, and it writes up the patent a lot cleaner, and it sails through the patent process faster is the bottom line. I mean, you still have to go through the whole waiting list, but when it sits in front of the person who's doing the analysis at the patent office, that person immediately gets what that person needs. We did the same thing with a couple of professors at LSU that were writing research grant proposals, right? And they were like, oh, we don't really have a persona. I was like, yes, you do. It's the person who is evaluating your grant application. And so we taught them how to analyze that persona and understand what that persona is thinking about when they get that application. And for the first time in his life, one of our guys, he shot me the email. The person who received his grant application emailed back and complimented him on how thorough and articulate this grant application was. So yeah, there's lots of different reasons why you have a persona. And the minute you put that in there, the results are just way better.
Yeah, absolutely. I noticed that I'll use ChatGPT a lot of times to write like thank you cards, little thank you notes and emails and stuff like that. And I always get a much better result if I put something like, a thank you card from, executive vice president of technology, sending it to the chief operating officer at this for this company. And it kind of like puts it helps it a lot better than if it was just a basic thank you note.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, let me give you a couple other examples. So if you're in business and the people who are listening to this are in business, think about it in terms of sales proposals, right? So most of the time, and we'll kind of move it forward in the sales process, most of the time you're going to have a sales interview with somebody. Now, in today's world, a lot of those are done online. So many of them are done on Zoom or Teams meetings or something like that. Well, if you put an AI note taker in there, the note taker will record your conversation. And now, instead of you having to take copious notes, you've got an AI tool that will take those notes. That AI tool will not only tell you what that prospect's pains and problems were that you can push back into the proposal so they know you heard them, but you can take that entire conversation, and I've built a GPT that does this. I had it analyze the conversation and essentially create an AI version of a disc profile of my prospect. So I now understand, if you're familiar with a disc profile.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. So I wanted to kind of understand how this person's thinking, but at the same time, I've already had the GPT analyze that person's company, analyze that person's role, kind of create a profile, but then I turn around and I add that disc profile to it. And then what I do is I take that profile and that persona with all that information, and then I tell the AI to become that. Okay. So that's its persona. And then I turn around and I upload my proposal and I say, I want you to be my target person and analyze my proposal and then tell me what questions you have. And then I'll go back and forth and refine the proposal inside of the AI based on that, that target persona that I just finished interviewing, et cetera. And the proposals that you come up with is awesome, but also think about it in terms of role playing. I could now role play with my AI before I even present the proposal and get a pretty good idea of where my prospect is going to go off the rails. And I need to get prepared to address that up front.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like a leader could probably use this to create profiles of their employees and practice one-on-ones and things like that, or employee performance reviews of how someone's going to take, some bad news or something like that to help them refine that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot that you can do with it, but that's just one of those, blocks. If you're developing big detailed blocks about your products, your services, the problems they solve and all that stuff, and you put those in a GPT, once again, anything that you produce is going to be far, far better and resonate far better with your audience because now you've given AI all of that. With most agencies, they'll create a persona for your company and they'll charge you a fair amount for that, but they rarely use it after that, right? They'll go maybe glance at it, but when they're writing, whether it's social media posts or a blog post or a sales page or anything else like that, they glance at that persona, if that, and then they go about writing stuff. But
Yeah.
AI uses it 100% of the time, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking when I created this podcast, I created like an avatar in my head of who would be the listener and what would they would do. And, I wrote that stuff down of like what their age range would be, what their career level would be and things like that. But you're right. Once I created it and thought about it, then I kind of don't use it anymore,
Right.
But if I put that into an AI model and then ran things past it, then it could help me refine based off of that avatar that I created.
Yeah, correct. And I think, where a lot of people kind of make mistakes on persona development is they really think of more in terms of demographics. How old are they? What's the predominant, sex? Are they more male, more female? What's their income range? All that stuff. But when you really get into the psychographics and the emotional drivers and you put that into a persona, that's where things change. And that's where you really get the value out of it. And that's the part that sometimes we forget. If we just keep that persona in our heads, we're typically just thinking about the easy stuff, those demographics, like I said. But when you really think about it, and you put those emotional drivers in there, things really change. I'll give you one quick, for instance. One of the things that I always ask people back in when we were doing our agency is I would ask people and I would tell them up front, look, this is a trick question. So I want you to pay attention to how I ask it. And I would say, what are the top 3 problems you solve for your customer? And 95% of them would answer it wrong. And And then I would say, okay, well, remember I told you it was a trick question. So I want to ask you one more time, and I want you to try one more time to answer this. What are the top 3 problems you solve for your customer? And what happens is, you could probably imagine, John, they come back and they tell me the top 3 products they sell to their customer, or the top 3 solutions they provide to their customer, but they can't articulate it as a problem. And I need them to articulate it as a problem because their customer has the problem, right? They got the pain. That's what you can get AI to do, right? Oh, and this is another thing. I even tried it with AI to get AI to articulate the problem. And I had to go back and forth 5 times before AI even got it right. So don't feel bad if you're a business owner, you don't know what problems you solve. But when you get that nailed down, and you can articulate it as a problem, then you really are able to produce some content that will resonate. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Cause I just think about it like, if you ask me, I was trying to go through that question for this podcast. Like, so what problems do I solve? And I'm trying to say, well, I teach people about leadership. I help connect people with external resources, help sell books for guest audience or whatever. But in reality, it's a lot of it's entertainment, and it's just time in the car. And it's probably a little bit different than the things that I'm hoping that I sell or that I want. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. But what you just did is you listed the things that you produce in the podcast, but you didn't list the problems that your listeners have. Right. Mm-hmm. And so if you start thinking about what problems they have, now all of a sudden you're opening yourself up to a whole new world of solutions you can provide. But not only that, but you're able now to write new leads for your podcast, new leads for thumbnails, right? Anything that you're going to be doing, if you were doing video podcasts, and I know yours are audio, but either way, the more you know about the pains and problems that you solve, the more your writing changes and the more people you bring in, because people aren't looking to buy a product, they're looking to solve a problem. And so they have to recognize their problem in what you're trying to solve for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And, it's just it's a way that I haven't really thought about, this whole process. So yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, again, that's why we spend so much time on these 9 blocks of the strategy canvas when you go through it to produce a prompt. Now, you're not going to have to go through all 9, but when you're really trying to execute something that's going to have impact, you need to be thinking through those 9 context blocks. Whereas most people just dive in and they start asking the ChatGPT to do something. But the more you know about what you need to ask it, the better those results are going to be right off the first take, And again, you don't have to ask it every single time. You don't have to provide it every single time. Once you go through the exercise, then it becomes this repository of knowledge that your GPT will call on.
Yeah. So how can people connect with you online and learn about those 9 context blocks and pick up a copy of your book where they can find them?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is called Ingrain AI, Strategy Through Execution. And it's about how to build an AI first culture in your organization. If they want to, they can go to ingrain.ai and learn more about the book, or they can go to Bizzuka, bizzuka.com/ingrain. Either way will get them there. And, they can follow me. I'm on LinkedIn, JW Munsell, or they can follow Bizzuka on LinkedIn, which is also Bizzuka. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. I'll link those 2 in the show notes at geekleader.com so people can go there and click through and check out the book and follow you as well. So, John, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Hey, man, I appreciate you. Have a good one.
You too.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to, click on their links, and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. And make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.